Racist Cops Act backfires when Black women's allies arrive. In this eye-opening and powerful video, we delve into a shocking incident that unfolds when a racist cop's unjust actions take a surprising turn. Witness the moment a Black woman, targeted by the officer, stands her ground with courage and resilience. What starts as an act of discrimination quickly turns into a testament to the power of community and solidarity. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
It was late afternoon, and Aliyah had just finished an intense day in court, where she had passionately argued a case involving police misconduct. Exhausted but satisfied with her work, she decided to stop by the park to decompress before heading home. Dressed in a sharp but simple black suit and carrying her leather briefcase, she strolled through the park's winding paths. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement as she approached the fountain, the rhythmic sound blending with the gentle trickle of water and the distant hum of city life. The park was alive with its usual assortment of joggers, families, and street musicians, but Aliyah's attention was drawn to the fountain. She stood before it for a moment, letting its presence calm her. She had always admired the inscriptions on its stone-based powerful words etched by a generation that refused to bow to oppression. The phrase "justice is a right, not a privilege" was her favorite, and she often recited it silently as a source of motivation. As Aliyah prepared to sit on a nearby bench, she noticed a man in a police uniform standing several feet away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had an air of authority that seemed intentionally exaggerated. His name tag read Officer Derek Walsh. Walsh was notorious in the community, known for his aggressive behavior and history of racial profiling. He had a reputation for targeting minorities, particularly Black residents, under the guise of maintaining order. His presence in the park felt out of place, as if his sole purpose was to disrupt the peace rather than protect it. Walsh had been recently reprimanded for using excessive force during an arrest, and his frustration over the incident had only deepened his anger. He scanned the park with a hawk-like gaze, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Aliyah. To Walsh, Aliyah was an anomaly. Her poise, her presence, the way she carried herself, it irritated him. She didn't fit into the stereotypes he clung to, and that unnerved him. In his mind, she didn't belong there. She was too polished, too confident, too self-assured to be anything but trouble. Walsh adjusted his stance, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, a habit he had developed to intimidate. As he approached her, Aliyah noticed his movements and instinctively tensed. She had dealt with officers like him before, men who believed their badge granted them unchecked power, who masked their prejudice with the veneer of law enforcement. Aliyah wasn't intimidated, but she knew to stay cautious. "Excuse me, ma'am," Walsh called out, his tone sharp and uninviting. Aliyah turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "Is there a reason you're loitering here?" he continued, his voice dripping with authority. Aliyah raised an eyebrow, surprised by his immediate hostility. "Loitering," she repeated, her tone measured. "I'm just taking a moment to relax." "Is that a problem, officer?" Walsh's eyes narrowed further, and he took a step closer, invading her personal space. "This is a public park," he said curtly. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. I'll need to see some ID." Aliyah's jaw tightened. She had done nothing to warrant such scrutiny, and his demand felt like an accusation. "Suspicious activity," she echoed, her voice steady. "I'm standing near a fountain in a public park. How is that suspicious?" Walsh didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward her briefcase. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. Aliyah's patience began to wear thin, but she refused to let her frustration show. "Just documents from work," she replied. I'm an attorney. Is there a specific reason you're questioning me? Walsh ignored her question, his focus fixated on asserting dominance. I'll need you to open it, he said flatly. Alia shook her head. With all due respect, officer, I don't believe I'm required to do that unless you have probable cause, she said, maintaining her composure. Walsh's face darkened, and his posture grew more rigid. You're awfully defensive, he said, his tone accusatory. Most people don't have a problem cooperating with law enforcement. Alia met his gaze without flinching. I'm fully aware of my rights, she said firmly. If you have a legitimate reason to detain me, state it. Otherwise, I'd like to go about my evening. Walsh's irritation boiled over. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. Her confidence felt like an affront, a refusal to acknowledge his authority. His hand moved instinctively toward his holster, a subtle but deliberate threat. Ma'am, I suggest you watch your tone, he said, his voice low and menacing. I'm just doing my job. Alia's heart rate quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew how dangerous this situation could become, how quickly it could escalate if she wasn't careful. And I'm just exercising my rights, she said calmly. Walsh took another step closer, his presence looming. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. Alia felt the weight of their stares but remained focused on the man before her. The sound of splashing water filled the silence as the fountain continued its rhythmic flow, a stark contrast to the escalating confrontation. Walsh glanced around, noticing the onlookers, and his scowl deepened. Let's move this conversation somewhere else, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before Alia could respond, he grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unyielding. The suddenness of his action caught her off guard, and she stumbled slightly as he began dragging her toward the fountain. What are you doing? She demanded, her voice rising. Walsh didn't answer. His grip tightened as he pulled her closer to the water's edge. The bystanders froze, unsure of how to react. Some reached for their phones, hesitating between recording the scene and calling for help. Others simply watched, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. Alia struggled against Walsh's grip, but his strength overpowered her. Let me go, she shouted, her voice echoing through the park. Walsh's face twisted with anger. You want to resist, he snarled. Fine, let's see how well that works out for you. With a sudden, forceful shove, he pushed her into the fountain. Water splashed everywhere as Alia fell, her body hitting the cold stone basin with a loud thud. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The park fell silent, save for the sound of water cascading from the fountain. Alia gasped for air, struggling to lift herself from the shallow pool. Walsh stood over her, his expression a mix of contempt and satisfaction. Stay down, he barked, his hand still resting on his holster. Alia's mind raced. She knew she had to act quickly, but the shock of the fall and the cold water left her momentarily disoriented. As she tried to regain her composure, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye, a figure sprinting toward them, closing the distance with alarming speed. It was her husband, Ryan. Ryan Carter was a man of calm demeanor, a quiet strength that rarely faltered, but the scene unfolding before him obliterated any semblance of restraint. He had been walking through the park on his way back from a local hardware store, a bag of tools in one hand and thoughts of a quiet evening with Alia on his mind. When he saw the gathering crowd and heard the commotion near the fountain, his pace quickened instinctively. Then he saw her, his wife, Alia, soaked and trembling as a towering officer loomed over her, barking commands with a posture that radiated aggression. Ryan's heart stopped for a split second, only to ignite into a roaring blaze of protective fury. Dropping the bag, he broke into a sprint, his boots thudding heavily against the pavement. In those few seconds, the world around him blurred. His focus locked solely on Aliyah and the officer, whose grip on his holster seemed to signal the possibility of something even more horrifying than what had already happened. Ryan had seen enough confrontations to know where this could lead, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to intervene before it was too late. "Hey!" Ryan's voice bellowed across the park, cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. His presence, a broad-shouldered figure moving with unrelenting purpose, caught the officer's attention. Derek Walsh turned his head sharply, his hand instinctively tightening on the holster as his predatory stance faltered. His eyes darted between Ryan and Aliyah, who had managed to pull herself partially upright in the shallow water. The officer's expression twisted into something between annoyance and defensiveness, as if he had been caught in the act but wasn't ready to back down. Ryan closed the gap in seconds, his chest heaving as he skidded to a halt just feet from Walsh. "Get your hands off her," he roared, his voice laced with a fury that made several bystanders flinch. Walsh straightened, his own instincts flaring to meet the challenge. He wasn't used to being defied, least of all by someone as physically imposing as Ryan. But Walsh had spent years honing the ability to assert dominance in situations like this, and he wasn't about to let it slip away now. "She's resisting," Walsh snapped, his tone sharp and commanding. "This is police business. Back off, or you'll be interfering with an arrest." Ryan's eyes burned with disbelief and rage. Arrest? For what? Sitting in a park, his voice thundered louder now, drawing even more attention from the growing crowd. "You think that gives you the right to throw her in a fountain?" Aliyah, now kneeling and gasping for air, looked up at Ryan, her eyes pleading for him to remain calm, though she knew it was a futile hope. Ryan wasn't one to watch idly while someone he loved was hurt. Walsh took a step forward, attempting to close the distance between himself and Ryan, his free hand raised in a warning gesture. "I suggest you back away," he growled, his fingers inching dangerously close to the gun on his hip. "I don't need to explain myself to you. She's under investigation." The words were hollow, an obvious attempt to justify his actions, but they only served to fuel Ryan's growing wrath. Ryan's voice dropped, low and seething, as he stepped closer, their faces now just inches apart. "If you touch her again, you won't need that badge to explain yourself. You'll answer to me." The threat was undeniable, and for the first time Walsh hesitated. He could feel the shift in the air, the collective tension of the crowd, and the unmistakable resolve in Ryan's eyes. But Walsh's ego wouldn't allow him to back down. He squared his shoulders, attempting to reclaim his authority. "Is that a threat?" Walsh spat, his tone dripping with false confidence. He was used to wielding his position as a weapon, and in most cases it worked. But Ryan didn't flinch. Instead, he stood his ground, his fists clenching at his sides as the adrenaline surged through him. Aliyah, still regaining her breath, managed to speak, her voice strained but steady. "Ryan, he's not worth it," she said. But the look in her eyes betrayed her own fear and frustration. Walsh seized on her words, twisting them to his advantage. "Listen to your wife," he sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Step away before you make things worse for both of you." Ryan's jaw tightened, his muscles coiling like a spring ready to snap. "You already made it worse when you put your hands on her," he said through gritted teeth. Before either man could move, the moment was interrupted by a small child's cry. A little girl, clutching her mother's leg nearby, pointed at the fountain with wide, frightened eyes. "Mommy, why is that man being so mean?" she whimpered. The mother quickly shushed her, pulling her away from the scene, but the child's innocent question hung in the air, a stark contrast to the tension boiling over between Walsh and Ryan. The distraction was brief but enough to tip the balance. Walsh, already on edge, misread Ryan's subtle shift in weight as an act of aggression. His hand shot toward his holster, but Ryan was faster. With a swift, calculated movement, Ryan knocked Walsh's arm aside and closed the gap, his fist connecting squarely with the officer's jaw. The force of the blow sent Walsh reeling backward, his balance faltering as he stumbled and fell into the shallow water of the fountain. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, some stepping forward as if to intervene, others frozen in place. Walsh struggled to regain his footing, his face contorted in anger and humiliation. "You're under arrest," he bellowed, reaching for his belt, but Ryan was already on him. Grabbing the officer by the front of his uniform, Ryan hauled him upright with a strength born of pure rage. "You don't get to play the victim now," Ryan growled, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken grievances. For a moment it seemed as though Ryan might throw Walsh back into the fountain, but the sight of Aliyah, still kneeling and drenched, brought him back to his senses. He released Walsh with a shove, sending the officer stumbling backward once more. "If you ever touch her again," Ryan said, his voice trembling with controlled fury, "you won't walk away next time." Walsh, now thoroughly soaked and humiliated, glared at Ryan, his hand hovering over his weapon but hesitating to draw. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a chorus of outrage and disbelief at what they had witnessed. Ryan turned to Aliyah, kneeling beside her and gently helping her to her feet. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice a stark contrast to the one he had used moments earlier. Aliyah nodded weakly, leaning against him for support. "I'll be fine," she said, though her trembling hands betrayed the adrenaline still coursing through her. The couple turned to leave, but Walsh's voice rang out behind them. "This isn't over," he snarled, his pride refusing to let the moment pass. Ryan didn't even turn around. "You're right," he said coldly. "It's just beginning." As they walked away, the crowd began to scatter, some lingering to exchange whispers about what had just transpired. The fountain, once a symbol of peace and resilience, now bore witness to a confrontation that was far from resolved. The tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. For Ryan and Aliyah, the fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. Ryan and Aliyah didn't get far from the fountain before Officer Walsh stumbled to his feet, his face red with a mixture of rage and humiliation. The water dripping from his uniform added a pathetic undertone to his threatening posture, but it was clear he had no intention of letting them leave without regaining some sense of control. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers twitching dangerously close to his weapon as he barked. "I said this isn't over. You think you can assault an officer and just walk away?" Ryan stopped in his tracks, his body still taut with adrenaline. He turned slowly, his eyes burning with fury, but Aliyah's trembling hand on his arm was enough to keep him grounded. "Ryan." "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the ordeal. "He's trying to bait you. Don't give him what he wants." Ryan exhaled heavily, his jaw clenched so tightly it felt like it might shatter. Every instinct told him to put Walsh back in his place, but he knew Aliyah was right. Walsh wanted a reaction, needed it to justify his escalating aggression. Walsh took a step forward, his boots sloshing as he emerged from the fountain. The crowd that had gathered around the confrontation remained frozen, some people murmuring nervously, others silently watching, unsure if they should intervene. The atmosphere was charged, the tension palpable, as Walsh's eyes darted between Ryan and Aliyah. He was looking for any excuse, any movement, to justify drawing his weapon. "You think you're tough, huh?" Walsh snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can assault a cop in front of witnesses and just walk away? You're going to jail. Both of you." His gaze flickered to Aliyah, his tone becoming even more demeaning. "You're just as guilty as him, sweetheart. You're resisting, obstructing justice. You people always think you're above the law." That last phrase hit Aliyah like a slap. Her composure, so carefully maintained throughout the confrontation, began to crack. "You people?" she repeated, her voice cold and sharp. She stepped forward, despite Ryan's attempt to hold her back. "What exactly do you mean by that? Officer Walsh, you've done nothing but harass me since the moment you saw me. I was sitting in a park, minding my own business, and you threw me into a fountain. And now you're trying to frame me and my husband for crimes we didn't commit. Who's really breaking the law here?" Walsh's face twisted with fury. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not so publicly. "I don't owe you any explanations," he spat. "You're under arrest, both of you. And if either of you so much as moves the wrong way, I won't hesitate to use force." He rested his hand on the grip of his firearm, making his threat clear. Ryan's fists clenched at his sides, but Aliyah refused to back down. She met Walsh's gaze with unwavering defiance, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "You don't scare me," she said. "You can threaten me all you want, but you know damn well that everything you're doing is illegal. You're abusing your power, and everyone here sees it." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a few voices rising in agreement. Walsh's gaze flickered to the onlookers, his confidence faltering for a moment before he doubled down on his aggression. "Shut up," he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. "All of you mind your business. Anyone interfering will be charged as well." His outburst only emboldened the crowd. Someone shouted, "You can't just assault people like that." Another voice chimed in, "We saw what you did. She wasn't resisting, you were the one attacking her." The tide of public opinion was visibly turning against Walsh, and he knew it. His face flushed a deeper shade of red as he turned back to Ryan and Aliyah, desperate to reassert control. Without warning, Walsh lunged forward and grabbed Aliyah's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "You're coming with me," he growled, yanking her toward him with enough force to make her stumble. Ryan's restraint snapped in an instant. He stepped between them, prying Walsh's hand off his wife with a grip so strong that the officer winced. "Don't touch her," Ryan growled, his voice low and deadly. "If you lay another hand on her, I swear." "Or what?" Walsh interrupted, his voice rising in mock bravado. "You gonna hit me again?" "Go ahead. Give me a reason." He stepped back just enough to pull his baton from his belt, gripping it tightly as he squared off against Ryan. The crowd gasped, some people yelling for Walsh to stop, others shouting warnings to Ryan. The situation was spiraling out of control. Ryan glared at the baton, his mind racing. He wasn't armed, and the last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation further. But he couldn't let Walsh hurt Aliyah again. He could see the madness in the officer's eyes, the desperation of a man who had already crossed the line and was willing to go even further to save face. Aliyah, sensing the danger, grabbed Ryan's arm, trying to pull him back. "Ryan, please," she whispered urgently. "He's not worth it. Let's just go." But Walsh wasn't about to let them leave. "You're not going anywhere," he shouted, raising the baton. "You're both under arrest for assaulting an officer and resisting arrest. Get on the ground now." When neither of them moved, Walsh lunged forward, swinging the baton with reckless force. Ryan reacted instinctively, his training as a firefighter kicking in. He sidestepped the attack and grabbed Walsh's wrist, twisting it sharply. The baton clattered to the ground, and Walsh let out a pained grunt as Ryan pushed him back. The officer staggered but quickly recovered, reaching for his gun. The sight of his hand on the weapon sent a shockwave of fear through the crowd. Several people screamed, and a few even began to run. But Ryan stood his ground, his body coiled like a spring. He knew that if Walsh drew his weapon, it could be the end for Aliyah, for him, for both of them. He couldn't let that happen. "Don't do it," Ryan warned, his voice calm but firm. "You pull that gun, and this won't end the way you think it will." Walsh hesitated, his hand hovering over the holster. For a moment it seemed as though he might back down, but his pride wouldn't let him. With a defiant growl, he drew the weapon, but before he could aim it, Ryan surged forward. He grabbed Walsh's arm with one hand and delivered a crushing punch to his midsection with the other. The officer doubled over, the gun slipping from his grasp as he fell to his knees. Ryan kicked the weapon away, sending it skidding across the pavement. Walsh gasped for air, clutching his stomach, but his rage hadn't diminished. He tried to rise, but Ryan shoved him back down with a forceful hand on his shoulder. "Stay down," Ryan said, his voice cold and unyielding. "You've done enough." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, their fear giving way to relief as the danger subsided. Aliyah rushed to Ryan's side, wrapping her arms around him as tears streamed down her face. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You could have been hurt." Ryan shook his head, his gaze never leaving Walsh. He wasn't going to stop, he said simply. Someone had to. As the tension began to dissipate, sirens wailed in the distance. The police backup was finally arriving, summoned by the onlookers who had called for help. Walsh, still on his knees, glared at Ryan and Aliyah with unbridled hatred. "You're both going to pay for this," he spat, his voice weak but venomous. Ryan didn't flinch. "We're not the ones who need to worry about that," he said. The arrival of additional officers signaled the end of the immediate danger, but the fight for justice was far from over. Ryan and Aliyah knew that the truth was on their side, but they also knew the system wasn't always fair. As they held each other in the aftermath of the confrontation, they resolved to see it through together. The wail of approaching sirens tore through the park's tense atmosphere, sending ripples of unease through the gathered crowd. Ryan kept his stance firm, his body still coiled with residual adrenaline, as he watched Officer Walsh struggle to his feet. The officer's once imposing demeanor had crumbled. His uniform was soaked, his face twisted with a mixture of humiliation and fury. Yet, even now, Walsh's eyes burned with defiance, refusing to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. He stood hunched, clutching his ribs where Ryan's blow had landed, but his ego wouldn't allow him to retreat. For a brief moment, the world seemed frozen. Ryan, Aliyah, and Walsh locked in an unspoken standoff, while the distant sirens grew louder. Aliyah tightened her grip on Ryan's arm, her fingers trembling against his skin. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. "The police are coming. Let's just step back. Let them handle it." Her plea was laced with exhaustion, a quiet desperation that spoke to the toll the encounter had taken on her. Ryan glanced down at her, his jaw still clenched, but the fire in his eyes softened. He nodded slightly, though his gaze never left Walsh. "Fine," he muttered. "But if he makes one more move..." Walsh straightened as much as his injured body would allow, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt. His gun was gone, kicked away by Ryan and now lying several feet away on the pavement, but his fingers found the cold metal of his handcuffs instead. Clinging to the last shred of his authority, Walsh held the cuffs in front of him like a shield, his voice rasping with desperation. "You think this is over?" He spat, glaring at Ryan. "You're going to jail for assaulting an officer. Both of you. I'll make sure of it." Ryan took a step forward, his fist still clenched. But Aliar's grip tightened, stopping him. "Don't," she said firmly, her voice regaining some of its strength. "He's digging his own grave. Let him." Her words were calm, but there was an edge of steel in them that made Ryan pause. He nodded again, stepping back as Walsh continued his tirade. The first police car screeched to a halt near the fountain, followed quickly by two more. Uniformed officers poured out, their hands hovering near their weapons as they assessed the chaotic scene. The sight of Walsh, disheveled and bleeding, immediately drew their attention. "What the hell happened here?" barked a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a commanding presence. His name tag read Lieutenant Graves, and his sharp eyes flicked between Walsh, Ryan, and Aliar. Walsh pointed a trembling finger at Ryan, his voice hoarse but filled with venom. "He assaulted me." And he jabbed his finger in Aliar's direction. She resisted arrest. "They're both dangerous, and they need to be detained right now." His words spilled out in a frantic rush, his desperation to reclaim control painfully obvious. Graves raised a hand, silencing him. "Calm down, Walsh," he said, his tone firm but measured. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Turning to the crowd, he addressed the onlookers. "Did anyone see what happened? I need witnesses to step forward." For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, one woman stepped out of the crowd, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She looked directly at Graves, her voice steady but tinged with anger. "I saw everything," she said. "That officer attacked her." She pointed at Aliar. "She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just sitting here, and he threw her into the fountain. And when her husband stepped in to protect her, the officer tried to pull his gun." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd as more voices chimed in. "She's right," a man called out. "That cop was out of control. He's the one who started this whole thing." Another voice added. "He threatened to shoot them for no reason. He's the danger here, not them." Graves' expression darkened as he listened, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to Walsh. "Is that true?" he demanded. Walsh's face flushed crimson, but he refused to back down. "They're lying," he shouted, his voice cracking. "They're trying to cover for each other. You know how these people are, they stick together, twist the story to make us look like the bad guys." Graves' gaze hardened, his jaw tightening at Walsh's choice of words. He stepped closer to the disgraced officer, lowering his voice to a dangerous growl. "Watch your tone, Walsh. You're making it worse for yourself." Then, without waiting for a response, he gestured to another officer. "Secure his weapon and get him out of here. I'll deal with him later." Two officers approached Walsh, one picking up his discarded gun while the other moved to restrain him. Walsh protested loudly, his voice growing shrill. "You can't do this, I'm the victim here. They attacked me." But his protests fell on deaf ears as the officers escorted him away, leaving Graves to turn his attention back to Ryan and Aliar. Graves stepped forward, his expression softening slightly as he addressed Aliar. "Mom, I'm sorry for what you've been through. Are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" Aliar straightened, her dignity intact, despite the water dripping from her clothes. "I'm fine," she said evenly. "But I want to make it clear that my husband and I didn't do anything wrong. That officer Walsh, he attacked me. Ryan was only defending me." Graves nodded, his demeanor professional but empathetic. "I understand. We'll take your statements and conduct a full investigation. I promise you, if Walsh acted outside the law, he'll face the consequences." He gestured to another officer, who approached with a notepad. "Please, tell us everything that happened." As Aliyah recounted the events in precise detail, Ryan stood protectively at her side, his eyes scanning the crowd for any lingering threats. The tension in his body hadn't fully dissipated, but he felt a glimmer of relief knowing that Walsh was no longer a direct danger. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that this was far from over. Officers like Walsh rarely acted alone, and the system they operated within was often complicit in protecting their own. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some lingering to offer words of support to Aliyah and Ryan. The woman who had first stepped forward to speak as a witness approached them, her expression resolute. "If you need anything," she said firmly, "I've got everything recorded. That cop's not getting away with this." Aliyah thanked her, her voice tinged with gratitude but also exhaustion. As the woman walked away, Ryan turned to Aliyah, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, his concern etched into his features. "I'll be fine," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. I can't believe this happened. And in broad daylight, in front of so many people." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with a mix of anger and sadness. "How many others has he done this to, Ryan? How many people didn't have someone to step in and stop him?" Ryan's jaw tightened as he looked back toward the fountain, now quiet and still once more. The water rippled gently, its serene appearance a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. "Too many," he said quietly. "But not anymore. We're going to make sure of that." Graves returned, his expression grave but determined. "Thank you for your patience," he said. "We'll file your statements and open an inquiry into Walsh's actions. I'll personally make sure this is handled properly." He handed Aliyah a card. "If you think of anything else, or if you face any retaliation, call me directly." Aliyah took the card, her resolve hardening. "I will," she said, "and I won't stop until justice is served." As the officers wrapped up their work and began to leave, Ryan and Aliyah stood together, their hands intertwined. The fight wasn't over, it had only reached its midpoint. But for now they had won a small victory. And as they walked away from the fountain, they knew they would face whatever came next together. As the officers began to disperse the crowd and pack up their equipment, Aliyah and Ryan found themselves standing near the edge of the fountain, their clothes still damp, the tension still thick in the air. Though Walsh had been escorted away, his venomous threats continued to echo in Aliyah's mind, a reminder that the danger was far from over. She could see the strain in Ryan's posture, the tightness in his jaw as his eyes darted around, scanning for any sign that someone might still try to escalate the situation. For him, the immediate physical threat had been neutralized, but the emotional fallout lingered, unspoken yet heavy. Lieutenant Graves returned to their side, his expression calm but serious. "I want to assure you both," he said firmly, "that this incident is being taken seriously. Walsh has been removed from duty pending investigation, and if the witnesses' statements align with what you've told me, there will be consequences." His tone was measured, professional, but there was an edge to his words, a hint of regret, perhaps, or maybe exhaustion from having seen situations like this one too many times. Aliyah nodded, her fingers gripping the edges of her damp blazer as she fought to steady her breathing. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," she said, her voice low but steady. "But with all due respect, I've heard promises like that before. Accountability in situations like these rarely reaches where it needs to." Graves didn't flinch at her words, though they clearly struck a nerve. "I understand your skepticism," he replied, "but this isn't going to be brushed aside. Not on my watch." His eyes flickered briefly to Ryan, who remained silent but watchful. "You've both been through enough today. Go home, dry off, and let us handle the rest. I'll be in touch." Ryan gave a curt nod, his hand resting protectively on Alia's lower back as they turned to leave. But before they could take more than a few steps, the distant sound of tires screeching on asphalt reached their ears. Ryan froze mid-stride, his instincts kicking in as he glanced over his shoulder. Alia followed his gaze, and her stomach sank as she saw a black SUV barreling down the narrow park road, heading directly toward the fountain. It came to an abrupt halt just yards away, and the doors flew open in near unison. 3 men stepped out, their movements sharp and deliberate. They were dressed in plain clothes, but their demeanor screamed law enforcement or, at the very least, men accustomed to wielding authority. One of them, a wiry man with slicked back hair and an air of self-importance, strode toward Graves with a badge already in hand. "Lieutenant Graves," the man said curtly, his voice cold and clipped. "Agent Thomas Reed, Internal Affairs. We'll be taking it from here." Graves' brows furrowed, his body stiffening as he glanced between Reed and the other 2 men, who lingered near the SUV with their hands resting conspicuously near their hips. "Internal Affairs? Already?" "That was fast," Graves said, his tone skeptical. Reed gave a thin, humorless smile. "We move quickly when there's a matter of officer misconduct. We've received complaints about Walsh in the past, and this incident seemed like the tipping point. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Carter." Alia felt a chill run down her spine as Reed's gaze shifted to her and Ryan. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. Ryan stepped slightly in front of her, his broad shoulders blocking part of her view, but she could still feel the weight of Reed's scrutiny. Graves hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden takeover. "With all due respect, Agent Reed," he said, "I've already taken their statements, and my team is handling the investigation." Reed's smile widened, but it was no less disingenuous. "I'm sure you've done an admirable job, Lieutenant, but this is beyond your purview now. Misconduct investigations fall under Internal Affairs, as you well know. So if you'll kindly step aside." Graves looked as though he wanted to argue, but after a tense pause, he relented, stepping back with a tight nod. "Fine, but I'm staying to observe." Reed didn't respond, his attention already fixed on Alia and Ryan as he closed the remaining distance between them. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, his tone oozing faux politeness. "I understand you've had quite the ordeal today. I'm here to ensure that justice is served and that any misconduct is addressed appropriately." Ryan's eyes narrowed, his posture remaining tense. "And what does that mean, exactly?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Reed tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "It means we'll be conducting a thorough review of all parties involved. That includes Officer Walsh, of course, but also anyone who may have escalated the situation unnecessarily." His gaze lingered on Ryan for a moment too long, the implication clear. Alia felt her pulse quicken, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Are you suggesting my husband is at fault for defending me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Because if you are, you can save your breath. Everyone here saw what happened. Walsh attacked me, unprovoked, and Ryan did what anyone would do to protect someone they love." Reed raised his hands in a placating gesture, though the smirk on his lips undermined the gesture. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mrs. Carter. I'm simply saying that we need to gather all the facts before making any determinations. I'm sure you can understand the importance of due process." Ryan took a step forward, his towering presence forcing Reed to look up slightly. "Due process?" he repeated, his voice laced with disdain. "Where was due process when Walsh threw my wife into a fountain and pulled a gun on us? Or does that only apply when it's convenient?" Reed's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. but he quickly recovered. I assure you, Mr. Carter, we take all allegations seriously, which is why I'll need you both to accompany us to the station for further questioning. Alia's stomach twisted. Questioning, she repeated. We've already given our statements. What more do you need? Reed's expression hardened, his veneer of politeness beginning to crack. Statements are one thing. Interrogations are another. If you have nothing to hide, this shouldn't be an issue. Ryan's fists clenched at his sides, but Aliala placed a hand on his arm, silently urging him to stay calm. She turned back to Reed, her voice cold and steady. We'll come to the station, she said, but only if our attorney is present. Reed's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded reluctantly. Of course, he said. I wouldn't have it any other way. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud as Reed gestured toward the Sov shall we. Ryan and Alia exchanged a glance, their unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't over, it was only getting worse. But they had faced adversity before, and they would face it again, together. As they climbed into the back of the Sov, Alia couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Reed's smug demeanor, the sudden involvement of internal affairs, the thinly veiled threats, it all felt too calculated, too personal. She glanced at Ryan, who sat rigidly beside her, his jaw set in a hard line. We'll get through this, he said quietly, his voice steady but grim. No matter what they throw at us. Alia nodded, though her chest felt tight with apprehension. As the Sov pulled away from the park, the fountain faded into the distance, its waters calm and still, once more a stark contrast to the storm brewing ahead. The interrogation room was cold and uninviting, its sterile walls painted a dull grey that seemed to sap the warmth from the air. Alia and Ryan sat side by side at the metal table, their hands resting on its smooth, cold surface. Across from them, Agent Reed leaned back in his chair, his expression one of calculated detachment. The fluorescent light overhead cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the faint smirk that tugged at the corners of his mouth. The two other internal affairs agents flanked the room, silent sentinels who added to the oppressive atmosphere. Alialia's attorney, Melissa Cruz, sat beside her, a sharp contrast to Reed's smug composure. Melissa was a formidable woman, known for her unrelenting advocacy and razor-sharp intellect. She had arrived at the station less than an hour after Alia's call, her presence a quiet reassurance amidst the storm. Now she fixed Reed with a steely glare, her arms crossed as if daring him to cross a line. Let's cut to the chase, Melissa said, her tone brisk and no nonsense. My clients have been cooperative. They've given their statements. Yet, here we are, wasting time in this theatre of intimidation. What exactly do you think you're going to achieve? Reed's smirk widened slightly, his fingers tapping idly against the table. It's not about intimidation, Ms. Cruz. It's about gathering all the facts. There are inconsistencies in their statements. There are no inconsistencies, Melissa interrupted sharply. And you know it. You're grasping at straws because you're trying to protect Walsh. Isn't that right? Reed's tapping stopped abruptly, his gaze narrowing. I assure you, Ms. Cruz, internal affairs doesn't protect bad cops. We investigate misconduct wherever we find it. Alia, who had remained silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice steady but edged with steel. If that's true, then why are we the ones sitting here? Why isn't Walsh being interrogated? Or better yet, why hasn't he been arrested? You've had witness statements, video evidence, and everything you need to prove what he did. Reed's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. We need to confirm the circumstances. Walsh claims he acted in self-defense, that he was assaulted first. Given the severity of the situation, we have to consider all angles. Ryan leaned forward, his voice low and charged with restrained fury. Self-defense? You call throwing my wife into a fountain and drawing a gun on her self-defense? If I hadn't stepped in, who knows what he would have done. But let me guess you'll twist that too. You'll say, I escalated things, that I'm the threat. Because that's what you've already decided, isn't it? Reed's expression darkened, the mask of professionalism slipping slightly. Mr. Carter, I suggest you calm down. Making accusations won't help your case. Ryan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. My case. I didn't realize defending my wife from a violent cop put me on trial. Melissa placed a calming hand on Ryan's arm, her eyes never leaving Reed. Enough of this, she said firmly. You've got nothing. Either charge my clients with something which I'll gladly tear apart in court or let them go. Reed leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting between Melissa, Aliyah, and Ryan. For a moment the room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, Reed stood, straightening his jacket. You're free to go, he said, his tone clipped. For now. But don't think this is over. We'll be in touch. Aliyah and Ryan exchanged a brief glance, their relief tempered by the knowledge that this was far from finished. As they rose from their seats, Melissa gathered her papers with sharp, deliberate movements, her expression one of simmering anger. This isn't the end, she muttered under her breath as they left the room. Not by a long shot. The three of them exited the station and stepped into the cool night air. The streetlights cast a dim glow over the nearly deserted lot, their car parked a short distance away. Aliyah wrapped her arms around herself, the chill biting through her damp clothes. Ryan immediately shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his touch lingering on her arm. Let's go home, he said softly. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. But tomorrow came sooner than expected. As they drove through the city's quiet streets, Ryan noticed headlights in the rearview mirror, a black SUV following too closely. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, a sense of unease prickling at the back of his neck. He glanced at Aliyah, who was resting her head against the window, her eyes half closed. She hadn't noticed the vehicle yet. Something's not right, Ryan muttered, his voice low. Aliyah straightened, her brows furrowing as she looked at him. What is it? Ryan nodded toward the rearview mirror. That car's been tailing us since we left the station. Aliyah turned to look, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the SUV. It could be a coincidence, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Ryan shook his head. I don't think so. Hold on. He turned sharply at the next intersection, watching as the SUV mirrored his movements. His suspicions were confirmed. They're following us, he said grimly. Hold tight. Aliyah gripped the edge of her seat as Ryan maneuvered through the streets, his firefighter training kicking in as he navigated with precision. The SUV stayed close, its intentions unmistakable. Melissa, seated in the back, leaned forward, her voice urgent. Do you think it's Walsh? Or internal affairs? Does it matter? Ryan replied, his eyes fixed on the road. They're not getting to us. The chase intensified, the SUV attempting to cut them off at a narrow alleyway. Ryan swerved just in time, the tires screeching as he regained control. Aliyah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities. Who were these people, and what did they want? Finally, Ryan spotted an opportunity, a sharp turn into a parking garage. He took it without hesitation, the car's engine roaring as they sped up the ramp. The SUV followed, its headlights casting long shadows against the concrete walls. Ryan pushed the car to its limits, climbing higher and higher until they reached the top level. He pulled into a corner and killed the engine. the three of them ducking low as the SUV circled the garage. The tension was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity as they waited in silence. Eventually, the sound of the SUV's engine faded, leaving only the distant hum of the city below. Ryan exhaled slowly, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. "Are they gone?" Aliyah whispered. Ryan nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the exit. "For now. But this isn't over." They stayed in the garage for another hour, waiting to ensure the coast was clear before finally heading home. When they arrived, the sense of safety they once associated with their apartment felt like a distant memory. Every creak, every shadow seemed to carry a threat. As they locked the door behind them, Aliyah turned to Ryan, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "We need to fight this," she said. "All of it. Walsh, internal affairs, whoever's behind that SUV. We can't let them intimidate us." Ryan nodded, his expression resolute. "We won't," he said. "They messed with the wrong people." The following morning, Aliyah and Ryan awoke to a city that seemed eerily quiet. Despite the exhaustion from the previous day's ordeal, neither had slept well. The events had replayed in their minds on an endless loop: Walsh's attack, the interrogation at the station, and the ominous chase through the streets. Every detail felt sharper in the light of day, every threat more tangible. Yet, as they sat together at the small kitchen table, their hands intertwined over cups of untouched coffee, there was a shared resolve between them. They weren't going to back down. Aliyah had already been on the phone with Melissa, their attorney, outlining the next steps. Melissa was relentless, reassuring them that Walsh's actions and the sudden appearance of internal affairs raised enough red flags to warrant a deeper investigation. "We're going to use this," Melissa had said firmly. "This isn't just about Walsh anymore, it's about the entire system that allows people like him to operate unchecked." Ryan had taken a more practical approach. He'd called a few trusted friends from his firehouse, people he knew he could rely on. Together, they'd agreed to discreetly look into Walsh's background, using their connections to uncover anything that might explain his behavior or reveal who might be protecting him. "We need leverage," Ryan had said. "Something they can't bury or ignore." As the day unfolded, it became clear that their fight was already gaining momentum. Several witnesses from the park had come forward with statements and videos, some even posting their accounts online. The footage painted a damning picture of Walsh's unprovoked aggression and Ryan's defensive actions to protect Aliyah. The story was beginning to spread, and while that brought a sense of vindication, it also carried new risks. By midday, Melissa called with an update. "Internal affairs isn't just watching Walsh, they're watching you," she warned. "The SUV last night wasn't a coincidence. I've confirmed that Walsh has connections to a network of officers who've been accused of covering up misconduct for years. They'll do whatever they can to silence you." Aliyah's grip on the phone tightened, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Then we'll make sure they can't," she said. "If they want a fight, they'll get one." Ryan listened quietly as she relayed the conversation, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he stood and grabbed his jacket. "Where are you going?" Aliyah asked, concern flickering in her eyes. "To the firehouse," he said. "If Walsh has friends in high places, we're going to need all the support we can get. I'll be back soon." Aliyah nodded, watching him leave before turning her attention to her laptop. She began drafting an account of the events, carefully detailing every interaction and including the names of witnesses who had offered their support. If they were going to expose the truth, they needed to control the narrative. By late afternoon, Ryan returned with new information. He had spoken with a fellow firefighter who had connections within the police department. What he learned was both infuriating and unsurprising. Walsh had a long history of excessive force complaints, but each one had been swept under the rug by higher-ups. More troubling, the same names kept appearing in those cases' officers and administrators who seemed intent on shielding Walsh and others like him from accountability. "They're all part of the same circle," Ryan said, pacing the living room as Aliar took notes. "It's a system. They protect their own, no matter what. And if we're going to take them down, we need to show how deep it goes." As evening fell, Melissa arrived with additional updates. She had managed to obtain copies of internal reports that corroborated what Ryan had uncovered. "This is big," she said, spreading the documents across the dining table. "If we can connect these cases to Walsh's actions, we're not just looking at disciplinary action, we're looking at a systemic failure." The next step was clear. They needed to bring everything to light. Together, Aliar, Ryan, and Melissa began compiling the evidence, organizing it into a comprehensive case that would be impossible to ignore. The work stretched late into the night, but none of them complained. Every document, every statement felt like a step closer to justice. The breakthrough came the following morning, when one of the witnesses from the park, a woman named Eleanor, called Aliar directly. "I found something you need to see," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with urgency. "I didn't know if it was relevant at first, but after seeing everything online, I think it might be the missing piece." Eleanor explained that she had recognized Walsh from a previous incident. Several months earlier, she had witnessed him in a heated argument with another officer at a local diner. The other officer, a younger man, had accused Walsh of misconduct, loudly declaring that he wouldn't be part of this anymore. The argument had ended abruptly when Walsh threatened him, saying, "You'll regret this if you don't fall in line." Aliar's mind raced as she listened, the pieces beginning to fall into place. If they could find this other officer, he might be the key to exposing the full extent of Walsh's corruption. Melissa acted quickly, using her network to track down the officer. His name was Daniel Vega, and he had recently transferred to a different precinct likely to escape Walsh's influence. When they finally reached him, Vega was hesitant to talk, but Aliar's calm yet impassioned plea convinced him to meet in person. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Vega was nervous, his eyes darting around the room as though expecting Walsh to appear at any moment. But as Aliar and Ryan reassured him of their intentions, he began to open up. "I knew Walsh was bad news from the start," Vega said, his voice low. "But it wasn't just him. There's a whole group of them, officers, supervisors, even some in internal affairs. They cover for each other, destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses. It's like a secret club, and if you don't play along, you're out." Vega went on to describe how he had tried to report Walsh's actions, only to be threatened and ostracized. "I couldn't take it anymore," he admitted. "So I transferred. But I kept copies of everything, emails, reports, even recordings. I couldn't just let it disappear." When Vega handed over a flash drive containing the files, Aliar felt a surge of hope. This was it, the undeniable proof they needed. The next few days were a whirlwind. With Melissa's help, they filed a formal complaint, backed by the mountain of evidence they had gathered. They also contacted several journalists, ensuring the story would reach the public. By the time Internal Affairs tried to push back, it was too late. The truth was out. Walsh was suspended indefinitely, pending a criminal investigation. Several of his associates faced similar scrutiny, their once untouchable network crumbling under the weight of public outrage.